Welcome back. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, bringing you a discussion show on the mounting violence in Syria. Abdo Hussameldin has made up his mind. The deputy Syrian oil minister has become the first high-ranking civilian official to abandon President Bashar al-Assad since the uprising against his rule erupted a year ago. He described a criminal regime that the United Nations says is responsible for 7,500 civilian deaths and possible crimes against humanity. While comparable bloodshed in Libya led to NATO airstrikes, the international community is deadlocked on Syria. Russia and China oppose intervention and have vetoed resolutions in the UN Security Council. The Americans have debated military action this week, but President Barack Obama expresses caution. So, should the international community arm Syria's rebels, or is possible breakup of Syria into Lebanon-style interreligious carnage too frightening to countenance? And what happens to the treatise of humanitarian intervention when the great powers cannot agree? To probe these big questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Edward Burke from the Centre for European Reform, Sean Maguire, a spokesman for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and on the line from Moscow by Alexandr Kuznetsov, a Middle East analyst there. Okay, to get the ball rolling, do you think foreign powers should provide Syria's rebels with military support? Edward, first of all, you.
No, I don't. It's a simple answer.
And Alexander in Moscow?
I think that great powers must not provide the military support to the Syrian rebels because the current events in Syria and the current political withstanding in Syria is the internal affair of the Syrian people. And only Syrian people can make any decisions and can regulate their situation.
Okay, Sean?
I'm not going to express a view on that. We're politically neutral, and that's a political question. Our focus is on the humanitarian situation on the ground, and from our point of view, we want to make sure that whatever is done does not exacerbate the situation for people who are already suffering quite seriously.
Okay, and maybe I'll throw it back to you, Edward, because you expressed extreme caution here.
Yes, no, I think that we have to be cognizant that the Syrian opposition is not united, that the Syrian National Council does have serious factions within it, and that there are various rebel movements that are seeking arms. Frankly, we don't know enough about who these movements are. We do not have a cohesive opposition partner in Syria. We have a lot of exile groups outside Syria claiming to represent the opposition movement. But we have nothing on the sort of unified coalition scale that we saw, for example, in Libya. So right now, there is a danger of the conflict in Syria escalating into a full-out sectarian war in which people from the Alawite community, from perhaps other minority communities, even the Kurds, may be targeted. So we need to be extremely careful that we don't, until we have a clearer political partner, that we don't provide the military means that may lead to more bloodshed as opposed to less.
Okay, well, I'd like to play a quote, and this is from John McCain, who was the former US presidential candidate, of course, still carries some sway in American politics, and he is taking a position that I think you're probably not going to agree with.
How many more have to die? 10,000 more? 20,000 more?
I think the question is the effort to try to build an international consensus as to what action we do take. What doesn't make sense is to take unilateral action at this point. I've got to make very sure that we know what the mission is. I've got to make very sure that we know whether we can achieve that mission, at what price, and whether or not it'll make matters better or worse.
Well, let me tell you what's wrong with your statement. You don't mention American leadership.
Okay, that was John McCain also having a discussion there with the American Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, expressing different positions on whether or not to get involved in Syria. Maybe, can I get your reactions to that, Alexander?
I think that the people such as John McCain don't know the real situation in the Middle East, and they don't count all the consequences of their proposals. If the military intervention may only exacerbate the situation in Syria, because of the majority of the Syrian people are against intervention, and even the peaceful Syrian opposition. And to my mind, we must provide to the peaceful Syrian opposition the chance to take part in the political process.
Okay, and Edward, I guess you're probably taking more of the Panetta position, but what do you think about what John McCain says?
I think, John McCain has a poor record in terms of being consistent. When thousands of people were being killed in Sierra Leone or in Liberia and West Africa, McCain tends to be a lot more vocal on strategic areas of strategic interest where perhaps Iran and enemies of the United States are at play. So I doubt his consistency about being just merely a humanitarian. I don't think that's always top of his agenda. But on the other hand, I think actually that Panetta has a point. What the United States is trying to do and the EU is trying to do right now is to get China and Russia united around a position that allows for the easing of the current Syrian regime from power. And that's currently probably the best option that we have. And there are some movements from China, from Russia, that suggest that they realize that the writing is on the wall for the Assad regime, that ultimately sanctions will have an effect. And therefore, there may be a realism creeping in Moscow and Beijing that allows us to move towards some negotiated transition process through the offices of Kofi Annan, the UN Special Representative. I think that is our best hope right now. I think the type of saber rattling that coming from people like John McCain is just not credible. He's not a credible actor. He was never credible in Iraq. He wanted to stay there for, as he said, 100 years if necessary. He tends to be extremely vocal on issues where Iranian interests are at play. He's not a wonderful humanitarian simply concerned about the lives of Syrians. He's got other issues in his head.
Okay, and on that point, I think I'd like to play another quote to you, another soundbite, and this one's from President Barack Obama, and he's expressing the kind of caution which I think is being shared by the analysts here in the room.
For us to take military action unilaterally, as some have suggested, or to think that somehow there is some simple solution, I think is a mistake. This dictator will fall as dictators in the past have fallen. But the notion that the way to solve every one of these problems is to deploy our military, that hasn't been true in the past, and it won't be true now.
And perhaps I'll turn straight to you, Alexander. Do you take comfort from what Obama is saying there?
I think President Obama says the right things, but I don't agree that the Syrian regime will necessarily fall in the recent future. And also, we have seen the civil war in Lebanon, for example, in the 1975-1990, and many foreign powers have interfered to the Lebanese civil war. And this process only exacerbated and deteriorated the situation. We remember the interference of the United States, of Israel, and some other powers. And even in the case when only the Lebanese themselves have sat on the table of the negotiations and have regulated the situation in Lebanon.
And maybe, Edward, how do you respond to Obama's comments?
He's demonstrating caution. He's very concerned about the internal situation, obviously, in Syria, not only in what the government is doing, but also in terms of what the consequences of military force. And he's always been a much more nuanced thinker about this than someone like McCain, for example, who seems to think that, the failure to apply force just means that you should apply more force. And that rather simplistic rationale doesn't take into account, as Alexander was saying, the very delicate balance that you have, ethnic balance and also rather fractured opposition that you do have within Syria. And you have to take these things into account. So I think Obama has done reasonably well. We are in a very unfortunate situation in Syria. There are no easy options. Sanctions take time to take effect. Unfortunately, governments, including in Beirut and Baghdad, have shown a reluctance to apply pressure on the Assad regime for various reasons. That has slowed down the effect of sanctions. In the interim, frankly, I don't think that a Western, perhaps a Paris or Washington Western-led military intervention in Syria is going to make things easier in the medium to long term. I think they'll make them more complex and very potentially a lot more bloody. If Turkey is not willing to use force in Syria as the natural leader of this neighbourhood and a natural ally of Europe, then we should think very seriously about our ability to use military force and question why Ankara doesn't want to do the same. So there are no good options at present, unfortunately. It's a terribly tragic situation. However, we do have to take into account these nuanced complexities of Syria, and Obama has done a better job than McCain at doing that.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the ongoing violence in Syria. I'm joined by Edward Burke from the Centre for European Reform, Sean Maguire, a spokesman for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Alexandr Kuznetsov, a Moscow-based Middle East analyst. Sean, I'd like to take this opportunity to turn to you because you obviously represent a humanitarian organisation. Perhaps you can give us an idea of the scale of the humanitarian suffering we're experiencing in Syria, particularly in the western city of Homs, where I understand the Red Cross has been trying to get access.
As I'm sure your listeners are well aware, there was very serious fighting in Homs for over a month, which led to almost the complete destruction of the suburb of Baba Amr. And that was where the resistance forces, the opposition forces, were fighting back. And there were very large scenes of combat there, which led to very grave humanitarian needs. Most of the population of Baba Amr fled, and there were large numbers of people displaced to other areas of Homs and to the villages around Homs. So those people, some of them are cold, some of them are hungry, in need of assistance, in need of shelter. So the aid effort is really about reaching those people and stabilising their situation. And that's Homs. Homs is perhaps the most serious situation in Syria at the moment, where the needs have been greatest. But there has been unrest from north to south, from Idlib in the north to Deraa in the south. And the Red Crescent and the Red Cross have been distributing assistance in those areas. What we've struggled with is getting access to those areas, getting access to the affected population. And that's something where we've been calling on the Syrian government to make more effort, to be more open, to allow windows in the fighting, call halts to the fighting, to allow us to get in, to meet the needs of the people. And that can be as varied from, as I say, blankets to baby milk to first aid. So there is quite a serious humanitarian situation, and the unrest has begun to affect the kind of economic situation for the whole of the population. So not only are you getting the terror of warfare, you're also getting the sort of economic degradation. So it's beginning to impact quite a large amount of the population of Syria.
Baroness Amos, the UN humanitarian chief, has been meeting officials in Damascus trying to secure access for aid workers. But what kind of political pressure can she bring to bear on this issue?
Well, I think it was interesting that when she first expressed a desire to go to Syria, she was rebuffed by the Syrian government. Consequently, there was a Security Council statement in which Russia and China joined the other P5 countries in expressing their disappointment that she was refused entry. And the Syrian government reversed its position on that, and she was allowed to visit, and that visit is still going on. Yesterday, she was in Damascus, and she went up to Homs to see the situation on the ground for herself. She went into Baba Amr with Syrian Arab Red Crescent volunteers and reported back that the heavy levels of destruction and essentially abandonment of that part of the city by the population. So I think she has some political weight behind her, and she's still in negotiations with the Syrian government. It will be interesting to see what she manages to secure.
I think, again, the United States has been criticised here, including by their own senators, including people like John McCain. But at the same time, US diplomacy, the US has been extremely active in trying to push Beijing and Moscow to support, for example, the humanitarian mission of Baroness Amos. And they have done so. And the message has come from Moscow that Baroness Amos needs more access and needs to be able to do her job in Syria. And that is movement. That is something that we didn't have quite recently. So I think that, again, we're in a very complex and tragic situation here. But to accuse Obama or to accuse Baroness Ashton, the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, of doing absolutely nothing is unfair. And there are some signs that diplomatic efforts are bearing at least some fruit in the short term for moving the humanitarian agenda forward. It's not perfect by any means. A lot more access, a lot more support for people like Sean, for the ICRC and for the UN is needed to get access to the people who need it most. And pressure needs to be applied on the regime. However, 2 weeks ago, I was much more pessimistic that the regime would even allow any access into Homs. So I'm hoping that this crack of light can be expanded. The only way that we can do that is by working with Moscow, Beijing, to ensure that this unacceptable situation does end as quickly as possible. And Kofi Annan is a good appointment as well. As a special representative for the United Nations, it doesn't get much better than that. I have some limited hope now that I didn't have quite recently, that things may be far too slowly moving in a better direction.
Sean, back to you. What would be this better direction? I understand that your organisation doesn't advocate for the use of force or any kind of military intervention. You're a humanitarian organisation, but there can be a link between the two. I know that some leaders have talked about opening humanitarian corridors, which is a kind of involvement of aid activity with the backup of some military involvement. So how do you tread that quite difficult path?
Well, we haven't supported the call for humanitarian corridors. What we've said is that we think there should be a daily pause in the fighting to allow humanitarian action, to allow aid to reach the affected, to allow the evacuation of the wounded, to allow the burial of the dead. We haven't had a response from the Syrian government on that. So we haven't been able to move forward on that suggestion. I think it's important here that we don't focus entirely on Homs and think that now that Homs is quiet after Baba Ammar has come back into government control, that the situation is over or in some way has ameliorated. There are suggestions that the fighting has begun to move north and that the focus of the government's military response is now around the Idlib area. So we are becoming increasingly concerned about the situation in the north of the country. What is important is that we are able to operate in these areas, and currently we can't. We haven't got sufficient access. We haven't got eyes on the ground. We're not able to assess the needs. So we think the idea of a daily pause is a good way forward. We hope that's what Baroness Amos is pushing on the ground, and if we can make some progress on that, we would be very pleased.
I understand that you'd be pleased, and of course I'm sure the people who are suffering in Syria would also be very pleased. But you say that you've asked the government in Damascus for this daily pause in hostilities and fighting, but they haven't responded. I mean, that sort of says it all, doesn't it? If the regime of Assad isn't going to do it, surely you require some kind of international force or pressure to make them.
What is important for us as an organisation is to be able to work on the ground. To be able to work on the ground, we need to have a dialogue with the opposition forces and a dialogue with the Syrian government. We've made our statement about what we think is necessary to enable us to improve the situation and ease the misery of the thousands of people who are affected by the violence. I think we need to keep this humanitarian strand separate from the political strand. There's connections, yes, but those connections can be made by the politicians at quite a high level. On the ground, it's important that we are able to negotiate with the Syrian government and convince them that these are Syrian people, these are their own people who need to be helped.
Alexandr, I want to bring you back in here, and I want to put perhaps a challenging question to you. To what extent is the lack of international consensus and the ability to bring pressure on Assad the responsibility directly of Moscow, being the lead country in stalling international concerted action through the UN Security Council?
I think the position of Moscow, the position of our country is to prevent their interference in the Syrian affairs from such countries as the Gulf countries, Gulf Arab countries, and from the United States of America. And to give a chance to the Syrian people to decide his destiny. And we know that the referendum on the constitution in the Syria took place, and the new, more democratic constitution was adopted by the majority of the Syrians. Now, to my mind, we have to create the conditions for all the peaceful oppositional parties and groups to take part in the political process and to elect the new Syrian parliament, which will decide the destiny of this country.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the ongoing violence in Syria. I'm joined by Edward Burke from the Centre for European Reform, Sean Maguire, a spokesman for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Alexandr Kuznetsov, a Moscow-based Middle East analyst. I've got one more question that I want to put to all three of you, and that's going to wrap it up for today. I started this discussion by talking about the Deputy Oil Minister of Syria, who abandoned the regime, Abdu Hussameldin, via YouTube. He said, "I joined the revolution of this dignified people," and he said he did not want to end his 33-year career in the government in Damascus serving the crimes of this regime. He even said that he knew the regime will burn his house and persecute his family. When things were falling apart for Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, we watched the defections of the senior ministers, and it in some way represented the crumbling of the regime. After what we've seen with the Syrian deputy oil minister, to what extent is this perhaps the beginning, the middle, or even the end for the regime of Assad? I'll put that first to Edward.
Well, I'd say first of all that it's just too early to tell. It's just, simply this is one deputy minister who's made this decision. It's impossible to tell what his personal reasons for doing so were. He's only actually just released this video, so it's far too early to make judgments like that. However, I would say that it is the Assad regime has been more resilient than many have predicted, and it may yet be more resilient, unfortunately, leading to entrenched and continued violence. The only way around this in the short term, I do think in the medium to long term, this regime is crumbling. In the short term, it's really crunch time for Moscow. Moscow has rejected a UN resolution for, reasons which to some degree were understandable. They thought the timelines, were too limited in terms of the Syrian military returning to barracks, that there would be a security vacuum. Some Russian concerns were actually justified, but then now what they have is the UN Special Envoy in Kofi Annan, and who they say they support. Now, do they support a negotiated transition away from the current situation? They need to show they do. The way that they do that is that they apply enough pressure, together with the rest of the international community, on the regime to accept that it needs to transition, that we need a national dialogue that brings the opposition into negotiation with the government. Until we have that, the violence will continue. And so that's what we need. We need Moscow and Beijing to show that they do support Kofi Annan, that they can oppose a resolution, fine, but they said they wanted a UN envoy. They have one. Do they support him?
Alexander, last chance to speak. Crunch time for Moscow.
I agree that we must support the efforts of Kofi Annan to initiate the dialogue in Syria between the Syrian leadership and the opposition. But inside the opposition, we must differentiate between the peaceful opposition and the armed rebels. Some of them are connected with Al-Qaeda, we know very well. And also we must provide the chance for the internal Syrian opposition inside the country, but not to the Syrian National Council. Because in Syria, majority of people don't know about this council. These are the politicians have not any authority among the people, even among the opposition.
Okay, and Sean, would you like to give any final humanitarian message to Damascus?
I think on your question of how long this is going to go on, unfortunately, the view of my organisation is that there will be humanitarian challenges for months to come. We are planning to have to be able to provide assistance to the people of Syria for some time. And that's not necessarily a view on whether the Assad government will survive or fall. Just our sensible precautionary estimate is that, unfortunately, there will be serious and grave humanitarian needs on the ground in Syria for some time to come.
That was Sean Maguire, a spokesman for the Red Cross, warning of a worrying humanitarian situation in Syria for months to come. I was also joined in this discussion by Edward Burke from the Centre for European Reform, and on the line from Russia by Alexandr Kuznetsov, a Moscow-based Middle East analyst. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.